better see ourselves as one people. Now, we as Asian Americans, we know that our people are complex people. Not only have we been at war with each other, invaded each other, caused each other to have famine, trafficked each other, and caused each other enormous amounts of pain, we have also migrated to each other's countries. We have married each other. We have created communities in diaspora within Asia as well as across the entire world. In fact, we are some of the oldest and largest global diasporas that exist today. In spring of 2021, more than 100 years after Chinese exclusion first took place, took hold in the country, and just about on the 100th anniversary of the act that banned all immigration from Asia to the United States, the Johnson-Reed Act, or the Immigration Act of 1924, the country was shaken by an act of terrible violence against spa workers in Atlanta. These were women who were of Korean descent and of Chinese descent, and they were part of a larger economy that was, at that time, included a number of South Asian women, including trafficked women as well, Southeast Asian women. And it was really at that time that the country became aware of the violence and the ongoing violence that these communities were facing. And we know in the aftermath of this crime, this triggered a national, as part of an ongoing national wave of violence against Asian Americans. We know that the country turned against many people with Asiatic features from across Asia. I have spoken with Nepali Sherpa people, with Tibetans, with people from across South Asia, with people from Southeast Asia, Filipino Americans. All of us were targeted in some way or another during this pandemic of hate, which converged with, at that time, the global COVID-19 pandemic. And at that time, it was very clear, one of the things that emerged in journalism circles and the narratives that we saw was that mainstream media, the national news, was waiting for the police to come up with a story that they could tell. In the meantime, in-language community-based journalists who knew all of the families of these workers identified the victims, within 24 hours began telling their stories, convened memorials for the victims, and began to host fundraisers for their families. This was not the first way that community media responded in these converging crises of disinformation targeting our communities, of the global pandemic in which our communities functioned as frontline workers and were therefore disproportionately affected, even though we were the first to adopt vaccines. We also were the first to on the front lines of these things. And it was at that time that our communities turned again to community-based media. They looked to community media for stories that were not being told elsewhere. We know that about 30% of the nurse and healthcare worker deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic were Filipino American, and yet during the entire scope of the pandemic, I might have seen maybe 2 stories in the New York Times about Filipino healthcare workers, and yet across the country, Filipino American community news were not only telling the stories, but were also providing information. There were outlets that were launched at that time, bilingual English and Tagalog outlets, that were launched at that time to dismantle disinformation around vaccines. And this outlet commissioned the first ever national survey of Filipino American attitudes towards vaccines. That has now built out an entire series of data-driven journalism stories for, by, and of Filipino American communities. This is not a new phenomenon. The first Asian American newspaper that was founded on the continent, on the mainland, was founded in 1854. And it was actually a reference to Gamsung. It was the Golden Hills News. It was founded by a white businessman whose main effort was to create opportunities and information for Chinese merchants to find access to their rights and integrate. As it later turned out, he was actually had a secret agenda to civilize the Chinese, who he saw as uncivilized or savages or as innocents. And throughout history, we have seen these same narratives repeated over and over again about multiple Asian American communities. Between 1850 and 1860, some 40,000 Chinese Americans immigrated to San Francisco. In the decade preceding that, there were 36 Chinese American immigrants. So we know that this was a period of enormous growth for this community. And with it came challenges. There were housing shortages, there were conflicts with other workers, but we also know that Asian American workers not only built the Transcontinental Railroad, but delivered the economic miracle that was California. They introduced crops like soybeans and rice that did not exist in this country, and they created an economy that eclipsed the GDPs of most other countries. So in this time, while we were contributing, while we were creating spaces for ourselves that are also integrating into the economy and societies that where we lived, we were also creating our community news. There's this stereotype of us that we are quiet. In fact, somebody once told me that I was atypical for an Asian woman because I'm outspoken and loud. And I said, have you actually met an Asian woman? I've never met a quiet Asian woman in my life. But if you look at our newspapers and our periodicals, we harken back to ancient traditions. There were court circulars throughout the Tang Dynasty. There were circulars across Asia. In fact, the first paper came from China. The first paper that the Quran was written on came from China to the Middle East, to then Persia, and then the Ottoman Empire later, where these newspapers were used to tell stories of kings and mythological stories. Across the coasts of Bangladesh, villagers would write down their news, pass the news on by horseback to another village, where news of that village would be added and then passed on. To this day, our communities find important ways to keep each other connected and informed, and to keep generations connected and informed. In the 1860s, through the end of the 19th century, we saw an enormous growth, not just in Chinese language news. By the end of the 19th century, there were an estimated 26 Chinese language newspapers across the country. But at that time, we also saw the emergence of a huge Arab American community here, what was called Little Syria. Between 1892 and 1940, here in New York City, that community produced and published over 50 Arab American and Arab language newspapers. In fact, there were two Lebanese brothers at the time who innovated the linotype to produce Arabic language press, Arabic language script, unleashing a global literary renaissance in Arabic around the turn of the century. As well as that time, in 1898, as you may all know, the United States concluded the Spanish-American War, and in so doing, annexed not only Cuba and Guam, but also the Philippines. Many people don't realize across the United States that in 1941, during the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was also an attack on Manila. And these people, during this colonization of the Philippines, after 1898, this unleashed a great resistance across the Philippines. They were sick of being colonized. Come on, they'd already been colonized by Spain for how long? So now they fought and resisted against the United States. In that war of independence, over 600,000 Filipinos died. These were new citizens of the United States who were murdered in the effort to civilize them and to bring them into the light of America. So, as a way to placate the Filipino Americans, Filipino students were offered a special visa called a pensionado visa. And those Filipino students came here to the United States and throughout the 20s produced over 40 pamphlets and zines organizing labor movements and organizing around agricultural work, which was primarily where Filipinos worked in California. As well as the Filipinos throughout the 1890s and into the 1920s, there were massive imports of Japanese American immigrants, mostly working in sugarcane farms across Hawaii. The first Japanese American newspaper was also born out of the largest strike of sugarcane workers in the United States history. One of the most landmark moments in labor organizing history was founded by a Japanese American who was himself biracial at that time. These outlets are all part of the story of Asian American community journalism of that era. This is an era that in many ways echoes our own. The rise of popular journalism, the establishment of the black press, and like we learned from our friend Wong Chiu-Fu, the black press worked in solidarity with Asian American media at that time. They had common cause. In fact, it was the black press that spoke out against Chinese exclusion, while, as you will have seen at that time, white press were not only inciting mass lynchings against black Americans and pushing it back against the efforts of Reconstruction, white American press were also inciting violence against Asian Americans. In fact, in the largest mass case of violence against Filipinos in the 1930s, the Watsonville riots, which took place over the course of several weeks and drove out Filipino workers from Watsonville, where they had established homes and communities. All of the language was produced in local newspapers, local white-led newspapers, and in labor organizing newspapers that were saying at that time that the threat was that these Filipinos were going to marry white women and pollute the race. So we saw at that time Filipino-American organizers who were also advocating for independence in the Philippines, were also organizing and pushing back against those narratives and conveying information to their communities to stay safe. At the same time, one of the largest expulsions of South Asian immigrants was also prompted by white-led media, which was fanning the flames of what was then the forefather of Islamophobia, the post-9/11 Islamophobia that we have seen take hold in the news. But that was at that time called Hinduphobia. There were massive amounts of publications throughout the late 1890s and through the 1920s talking about the emergence of a dusky peril, showing pictures of men in turbans as if they were alien species. They were simultaneously fetishized and also terrorized. And so those men, lumber workers in the Pacific Northwest, experienced mass pogroms and were driven northwards into Canada, where the Sikh community continues to have one of its largest global outposts today. The first Indian American newspaper was founded at this time, both in New York and in California, and was also pushing back against colonial rule. So we see in the era of Asian exclusion this effort not just to organize and keep our communities safe in the face of imperialism, discrimination, labor discrimination, and xenophobic policy and land laws at the time, but also to maintain diasporic connections and networks. Asian American newspapers were read across the entire world in those communities, just as today our community newspapers often fill the gaps in authoritarian violence overseas. Vietnamese community newspapers, as Vietnam experiences a decline in press freedom today, are now sending immigrants from here, born in the United States, as tourists there to report on what's happening on the ground in Vietnam, which they're publishing in Vietnamese language newspapers here that are being read there. Asian American community newspapers across South Asia and Southeast Asia experience internet shutdowns as an authoritarian tactic and are therefore unable to deliver news to communities here that want to fundraise and support communities there. At the same time, our communities fill an essential and critical language gap by using not only legacy ethnic press, but also by creating all kinds of digital outlets not just on WeChat and Weibo, but on KakaoTalk, on Line, on TikTok, Instagram, and WhatsApp. Our communities are first and foremost the ones to figure out how to reach our communities where they are, how to serve undocumented restaurant workers who are sleeping in the back of restaurants during the COVID pandemic, how to serve Muslim communities and Sikh communities during an international global referendum on Khalistan, how to support our communities when the United States returns to its roots from the 19th century and brings back new land laws, property bans in 23 different states across the country, where there are now a number of states in which it is illegal for Chinese Americans, Iranian Americans, and select Korean Americans to purchase property. We are documenting these stories now. And in the Second World War, during the internment of Japanese Americans, where in all 10 concentration camps, Japanese Americans continued to publish their own newspapers, we saw that some of the oldest newspapers that continue to publish today, like Ralph Shimpo in LA, were founded, and the only time that they didn't publish was when their publishers were interned and imprisoned in concentration camps. Those same legacies we saw echoed in the post 9/11 era, when across New York, communities, Muslim communities, South Asian communities, and Sikh communities were not only facing a spike in interpersonal interpersonal violence and hate crimes, but were also seeing a massive decline in their civil rights, with warrantless raids across the community. And at that time, mainstream news was not covering what was happening in our own city at all. So Muslim community news and South Asian community news came to the fore. So this today I'd like to show for you is part of a storied legacy of community-based journalism, in-language journalism, innovation, resilience, survival, demanding that in the face of state-based violence, discrimination, xenophobic policymaking and legislation, violent rhetoric, and physical violence, physical harm,